Hello, I'm Bret Moss, and you're watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. Our guest today is Ernest Chu. Ernest Chu is the author of the newly released book, Soul Currency. He's a spiritual teacher and ordained pastor at the Center for Spiritual Living in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and leads workshops on the metaphysics of spiritual abundance. Ernie's also an accomplished entrepreneur and former investment banker and member of the New York Stock Exchange. He was also a staff writer and columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He has two sons, Chris and John. Ernie Chu, welcome to The Defining Moment. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you here to our studio today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming. Our topic today is investing your spiritual capital for lasting prosperity. And I'd like to begin by inviting you to share a defining moment from your own life.
Well, my defining moment was waking up one day and finding out that the financing of a company that I had invested a lot of my money and virtually everything that I had in it had all melted down because of some undisclosed information from my partner. And all of a sudden, I began to realize I had no income, and in fact, I had leveraged everything that I had. I took a second mortgage on my home. I had kept my expenses on my credit cards so that I could save the company money, and ultimately figured that I would be repaid once the company became up and running. And so all of a sudden that all disappeared. And obviously the need to pay the mortgage, the need to pay my credit cards didn't disappear. And so I suddenly found myself in an experience that many of our listeners today might have. I couldn't pay my mortgage. I couldn't pay my credit cards. I was scrounging to try to find out where I could borrow some money. I wasn't as fortunate enough to get a bailout like some people and like the banks got, but I really found it was a very desperate situation, and it got steadily worse. I would get as much as sometimes 60 phone calls a day from creditors. I'd get so much mail that literally I didn't have any place to put it. Boxes weren't big enough. It was a very tough situation because I couldn't declare bankruptcy, because if I ever expected to work in the financial arena again, that's a major disclosure item. And so I had to find another way to do it. It never occurred to me that this was such a situation that it was almost hopeless. I always had a degree of hope that I could do something with it, but as time passed on, I just didn't know exactly where to look. And so finally one day, I was able to go to a church in Morristown, New Jersey, where I had the opportunity to look at and listen to people talk about being very positive in their thinking. So when I came back, I turned the TV on in the room that somebody had graciously let me live in, and I was hearing someone else who turned out to be an entrepreneur. This is kind of late night television. He was selling something else. I think he was selling some type of product. I think it was a healthcare product, but he mentioned on that interview that he was bankrupt at one time, or had really gotten to a point, and that he never realized that there was life after bankruptcy, and that he began, after he had gone bankrupt, to have the greatest success of his life. So what I ended up realizing was, hey, I'm not that much different than this young man there. In fact, I actually have a better education. I've had more business experience. I have better contacts. I have some real assets in me. It's like I'm not starting from zero. And I had been telling myself up to that point, I've got nothing. And my world started reflecting that I had nothing. I even had to give away my cat. So when I finally understood that I have lots of assets, they're not liquid. And it was very understandable for me to see it that way, because I was the chief financial officer of a company. You'd think that somebody like a chief financial officer and somebody that was on Wall Street, that was a member of the New York Stock Exchange, would know better. these folks on Wall Street who were responsible for the financial meltdown, they didn't do it because they're bad people. They got so involved in that whole process. You become a player. You want to make the right decision. You think about it all the time. You love the action. It's almost instant gratification when you make an investment and then it goes up, and then you kind of have this moment of glory, and then you now have the next one and the next one, and so it becomes really a numbers game, and it becomes really a strategy, and the whole idea of being creative and your whole life spins around that. So when people like the folks at Lehman Brothers and the people that were shorting the stocks that caused the debacle of a lot of these financial institutions, they were like me. And I would have been the last person to ever write a spiritual book called Soul Currency, because that was what I was going through. Had it not been for, of course, this massive failure, which in hindsight, it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Wow, that's very fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. What are spiritual assets, and how can a person go about identifying them?
Well, spiritual assets is really my way of putting common things that we all understand to be real assets, but we never call them assets. Some of these things are called divine gifts. Some of these things are called your native-born talents, or you're born with a gift for gab, or you're born with a gift for music or color, or a way to make people laugh. Well, the one thing about gifts are that they're free, and so the human mind thinks when you get into a situation where you have to connect with the real world, where you have to pay your bills on a Wednesday, you might appreciate your divine gifts on Sunday at church, or being able to be with like-minded people. And you'll find that on Wednesday night, when you are with your checking account and making a checkout, and then having the realization that if you write this check and mail it off, that all of a sudden your account is going to be down significantly, and it's only the 15th of the month. And so there's a lot of fear that goes into that. But you see, what people don't see is that the source of all capital is your spiritual assets. And that's what I realized when I was literally $1 million in debt, because it was so hopeless when you're $1 million in debt. If you, for instance, had a job, and that job, say, paid you $150,000, it's a pretty good job, right? Mm-hmm. And you'd have an ability to probably put away $1,000 to $2,000 toward your debt. Now, if you're $1 million in debt, it's going to take you 200 years before you even make a dent in that debt. So you see what the power of spiritual assets, which I discovered in myself, and it's been there all the time, but I just discovered it, was when I started to realize these were assets and not necessarily gifts. Because when you have gifts, you don't realize the value of it. And most of us do a lot of things with our spiritual assets every day. But the only thing that we remember about that day is the times that we got embarrassed, or the times something went right, but we thought it was luck today, or I was really in the flow, which really translated means it's probably not going to happen again on a routine basis. It's just one of those days. But you see, it can happen. And so spiritual assets are really those wonderful gifts, that inner treasure trove of qualities that are within you that are directly translatable into the material world. So as an example, what do you suppose someone would pay for a week's worth of the imagination of J.K. Rowling? You know, she's the author of Harry Potter.
Right.
What do you suppose, for instance, somebody would pay for for the branding of Jim Henson's Muppets. Well, we know what they paid for it. They paid $345 million after he died. But when he started, his idea was that he liked to be clever and funny and to make people laugh, and he had such a gift to do that. He had an imagination. And so when he started, all he did was he made his own children laugh, and he did shows for the neighbors, and then he did shows for organizations, and it just got bigger and bigger. And that's an example of spiritual assets.
Okay, very clear. Thank you so much. How do spiritual assets become spiritual capital, which can then be invested in a way that is analogous to investing financial capital?
Well, there are two things here. One is spiritual capital, and the other is investments. And what I will tell you is that there is the belief that everyone has, that you can't make money without money. You can't create capital without capital of your own. Well, I'm here to tell you that, for instance, J.K. Rowling, when she actually developed Harry Potter, literally didn't have much in the way of capital. In fact, in order to write the book, she went on public assistance. She had 2 children, and the neighbors were undoubtedly saying, listen, why are you writing this fantasy book that nobody wants to read? You know, you have 2 kids. You need to go out and get a job to earn some money. And so what she did was she invested her spiritual capital. And her spiritual capital is essentially what you do is you really are activating your spiritual assets, because assets are like anything else. If you don't activate them, they're just going to sit there. You could have 80,000 acres of land in the Everglades or even in Florida somewhere, and it becomes a liability if you don't do anything with it. You have to pay taxes on it, you have to keep the upkeep on it, etc. This is a little different. You might have a talent for music or a talent for being able to have insights on when you see something that nobody else has. But if you never do it and you never think that you are capable of doing it, then the world's going to be worse off, because you never began to realize what your spiritual assets are. So to activate these spiritual assets, you don't need a magic formula. You just simply allow your intention and your focus to go on it. Because what we're talking about is a lot more powerful than money or other types of assets, such as things like land or office buildings or gold or jewelry or things like that. Those things tend to be very inert. But you see, when something such as intention and focus is added to those spiritual assets, such as imagination or insight or intuition or things of that type, it's almost like a conductor getting up on the podium to an orchestra that's already there, ready to play, that knows exactly what to do, and he said, and has all that infinite number of scores that they can draw on, and he says, okay, we're going to play Beethoven's Ninth today. And so the minute he starts to set that intention, it's like tapping that podium there, and when he starts to conduct it, everybody knows exactly what their role is. And what happens is that all the spiritual assets start to play that symphony. And so you don't have to sit there and say, my intention is that I'm going to basically start a company that's going to be in the medical area. You don't have to say, well, I'm going to use 25% of my imagination. I'm going to use 50 or 100% of my persistence. There's a spiritual intelligence that is active within you and that surrounds you, and all it needs is the word to say, go. This is what my intention is. And then to know that you're serious about it by devoting your attention, because energy goes where attention is put. So that's how you activate your spiritual assets. Now, what that is your spiritual capital. Now, the expression of how you do invest your spiritual capital, that's another aspect of it. There are really 3 levels of consciousness in investing. We only use one really in one of those particular levels of consciousness when we invest in money. The idea with money is you take this somewhat inert form of assets and you use it to buy something, or you use it to perhaps invest in a stock, or invest in real estate, or even invest in your children. And essentially what happens is that you're expecting a return. Usually the whole idea of investment is you invest something and you expect to get something back. The way spiritual assets work is you basically, the more you can give without any expectation of return or any attachment to what it's going to look like. Perhaps that's a better way of putting it. The return that you get really is so much greater. So that's why I say that true spiritual capital literally also has that component of love attached to it. And I define love as not just the feeling that you have, and it's not about being a better person. It's literally that source energy that surrounds us. So if you want to say, well, there's that infinite intelligence or God or whatever you choose to call it, the essence of that is love. But the essence of love is also creativity. That love really comes in so many forms, shapes, circumstances, and things. And so what happens is that when you add love to your spiritual capital, and I have a little equation that reads spiritual assets plus intention, I, plus focus, F, all multiplied exponentially by L, which is love, gives you an experience that really takes not only your spiritual capital, but it intensifies it. So that's how someone like J.K. Rowling can take a Harry Potter novel, and this is her world, create it and share it with millions of other children, and in about 10 short years be worth more than the Queen of England.
Okay. Beautiful. Thank you so much. That's actually very insightful. Tell us about prosperity. How do you define it, and what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes when it comes to the pursuit of prosperity?
Well, the most common mistake is to believe that your source is outside of yourself, and that your source also is really separate from God. Now, I'm not saying this because I'm a minister. I'm saying this because it's very clear that when you're in a situation where you're looking to create, there is a flow. There is a flow that really begins to become activated when you begin to experience the world as not you, but as a connection to all of life. And so prosperity is not just money. One of the greatest pitfalls is that people see prosperity as money. There's the old Beatles song that money can't buy me love. There's the old adage on Wall Street that says money can't buy me love, but it sure can rent happiness. And I'm not sure about that either. But very clearly, the things that you find are that it's when you finally, to be truly happy and truly prosperous, you'll find that when you add love to the equation using your spiritual assets, doing the things that are your strengths, doing the things that you know best how to do in the unique person that you are. So there are obviously a lot of people, as an example, who are counseling people on how to be more prosperous in the economy. Their workshops or their materials will range everything from learning to be friends with money and kiss a dollar bill or things of that type, to really a more mystical way of looking at it, of going deeply and perhaps in a more Buddhist tradition, chanting for prosperity. And what all of these things are ways to be able to enliven the energy around you. But where does that energy come from? That energy comes from something that's far greater and that you experience through the feeling of love, but you also experience it when you decide, for example, that you need to have more clients, or that you need to network a little bit more, and you'd certainly like to get the phone to ring a little bit more so that you can expand your either your business or expand your contacts. And so the next day, all of a sudden, you start to notice the phone starts to ring. And all of a sudden, it turns out to be people that say things like, Ernie, I'm calling you because I just found your card. It was in my Rolodex, or I've been meaning to call you for 8 months, and something always came up, so I finally got around to calling you. Now there's no such thing as coincidence, but the phone will start to ring off the hook. And you know what most of us will be? Most of us will act like, how did that happen? They act like they're very surprised that this is all happening. Yeah. But you see, when you start to look at this as really a connected way by which you can invest your spiritual assets and get a return that is far greater than what you would normally get if you just said, well, I only want 10%. Can you imagine that? I only want 10% of all the good that potentially is mine to have. Well, there might be some people who are into lack and limitation, and they'll say, well, I'll take that 10%. It's better than nothing. But you see, the whole point is that there is so much out there. When we're asked to think about something, what's the worst that can happen, we can come up with stories. We can think about the worst that can happen so that it's in color, and we have all in great detail. When we're asked about what's the best that can happen, we'll say something, and then we'll have to think about it because we're not used to really accepting that good in our lives. So when we invest our spiritual assets, we allow that form to be determined by that infinite intelligence that's around us, that energy of love that surrounds us, and you let it determine it for you. And you guide it. You obviously set that intention, and you set the focus of that. And what happens is the investment of spiritual capital, you get what I call, or the economists on Wall Street call, spiritual capital formation. And it just is something as big and as powerful as any small company or a Microsoft or an Apple or anything like that we're used to. And we think, oh, wow, they started Microsoft. I could never do that. Yes, you can. You can invest your spiritual capital. You can actually create something in your life, depending on what your intention and your vision is, that is equally as powerful.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. You mentioned the 3 levels of spiritual investment. Tell us more about that and why that's so important.
Well, the first level is really what the Dalai Lama very lovingly called self-cherishing. Now, what that means is that you cherish only yourself, or in a more pedestrian way, you think only of yourself. And so you see this happen a lot on Wall Street. Somebody gives you a stock tip, and so you go there and you take it, and you come back and say, hey Joe, that was a good stock tip. And he says, now you owe me big time. You owe me big time. How about dinner at 21? You know, that kind of thing. Or people won't do anything unless they get something back for it. They won't give you a contact number unless they get a piece of whatever comes out of that. And so that's one level of consciousness, and you see that very often in business. You see that, you probably know people like that. A second level is really a level by which you basically see your connection to perhaps a community or your company or the greater good that is served. And when we talk about greater good, we don't always necessarily talk about the greater good of humanity. It might be the greater good of your company, or the greater good of your family, or the greater good of your community. But obviously there's plenty of room for growth there, because as you begin to understand the greater good, you start to move toward the third level, which I call seva, S-E-V-A, which is a Sanskrit word for selfless service. And why I include that as part of your way of looking at investments is You would think, well, if it's selfless service, how are you going to get anything back? Well, if you talk to people like Mother Teresa, people like John of God, Albert Schweitzer, you talk to anyone who has spent any time in doing selfless service, and you'll find that the returns are not just money, but they're rewards. Now, can you make money doing it? Well, I'll give you an example. I basically went to Bloomington, Indiana to be a part of the Dalai Lama's class that he was giving for a week. He was taking other ministers, so it was a very ecumenical group, and he was going to talk a little bit about enlightenment. So I went there totally with that in mind, and I also went there in part to support the monastery that was established there. And as things would have it, I ended up sitting right next to two Americans who were from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we started talking about what we liked about the Dalai Lama and what we were here for, and they obviously had been there a number of times. And then they started to talk about themselves, and here I was talking about this situation about something that I knew very well, which was all about companies. And this man was an inventor, and he had invented a whole system to save water that consumers could use. Mm. And I scratched my head after that experience and said, wow, this is amazing. I came here really expecting to just give and to feel that I'm learning some, and that would have been really, I would have been grateful for that kind of return. And here I was, not only feeling that, but on top of that, I might have had a consulting client that really needs my help. And I always recognize that companies like this have great potential. And so this is something that would support not only my work, but the work that this man, the inventor, was doing in terms of conserving water.
Ernest Chu, I want to thank you so much for having been our guest. How can our viewers get a hold of your book?
Well, you can get it in almost any bookstore, Barnes & Noble's, Borders, and your independent bookstores, or Amazon.com. Or you can go to my website, and that website is www.soulcurrency.org. And if you go there, sign up for 7 Days to More Powerful Prosperity. It's a series of prayers that are very similar to what I use to go through my dark night of the soul. And you'll have those sent to you every day for 7 days, and it's free.
Okay, great. Well, once again, Ernest Chu, thank you so much for having been our guest. I really learned so much from reading your book and from having you here as our guest today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been watching The Defining Moment for Creating the Culture of Conscience. You can find us on the internet at www.definingmoment.tv. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.